Morning after my grandson's engagement party, I sat in my car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before I could make myself drive. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock on the dashboard. I do that sometimes when I don't trust myself to move yet. My hands were in my lap. The engine was off. And I kept hearing her voice in my head, that particular laugh, not a real laugh, the kind people do when they want you to know they find you ridiculous. I drove to my attorney's office without calling ahead. Walter has handled my affairs for 19 years, and he knows me well enough that when his assistant said I didn't have an appointment, he came out to the waiting room himself. He took one look at my face and said, "Come on back, Irene." That was the morning everything changed. But to understand why I was sitting in that parking garage at 7:45 in the morning, I have to go back a little further. I have worked with my hands my entire life. That is not a complaint. It is simply a fact. The same way it's a fact that I grew up in Akron, Ohio, that my mother's name was Louise, that I have brown eyes. I started cleaning houses when I was 19 years old, the summer my first husband left and took both paychecks with him. I had a 4-year-old son and $43 in a coffee can under the sink. And I needed work I could start immediately without a degree or a reference or anything except willingness. I was willing. I cleaned houses for a family in the west end of town first, then word spread the way it does in those neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone's housekeeper, and within 2 years I had more clients than I could handle alone. I hired 2 women to help me, then 4. By the time my son, I'll call him by what I always called him, which is just my boy, because this story is mine and his privacy matters to me. By the time my boy started kindergarten, I had a small cleaning company with 7 employees and a used van with the name painted on the side. I was not rich. I want to be clear about that. I was stable, which felt like a miracle compared to where I'd started. I paid my bills on time. I bought my boy new shoes when he needed them. I put a little aside every month in an account I didn't touch. The thing about running a cleaning business is that you see the insides of people's lives, not in a nosy way, in a practical way. You see which houses are maintained and which ones are falling apart behind fresh paint. You see which families actually live within their means and which ones are one missed payment away from disaster. After 15 years of cleaning houses, I understood property the way a doctor understands the body. I could walk to a house and tell you in 20 minutes what it was worth and what it would cost to make it worth more. I bought my first property when I was 41, a duplex on Clearwater Street that nobody wanted because it needed everything: new roof, new wiring, new plumbing on one side. I paid $48,000 for it. I did not tell anyone, not my boy, not my sister, not the ladies at my church. I just bought it quietly and spent the next 14 months fixing it up on weekends and evenings, watching YouTube tutorials, and calling contractors only for the work I genuinely couldn't do myself. I rented both units. The rent covered the mortgage in 11 months. Then I bought another one, then another. I kept the cleaning company running. I never stopped. My clients didn't know I owned rental properties. My tenants didn't know I ran a cleaning company. I kept everything separate, partly out of habit and partly because I had learned early that people treat you differently when they think they know what box you belong in. A woman who cleans houses gets one set of assumptions. A woman who owns property gets another. I preferred to move between worlds without anyone having the full picture. By the time I was 63 years old, I owned 14 residential properties across 3 counties and a small commercial building on the edge of town that I leased to a physical therapy practice. My net worth, according to the document Walter updates every January, was a number that would have made the 19-year-old with $43 in a coffee can faint dead away. My boy knew I owned some rental properties. That's how I described it when it came up, which wasn't often. He'd moved to Columbus after college, built a career in software sales, made a good salary, lived well. He didn't need my money, and I didn't offer information he didn't ask for. That was just how we operated. I was proud of him. I am still proud of him. What happened doesn't change that, though it changed other things. He called me in February to tell me he'd gotten engaged. Her name is Courtney. No, wait. I was told not to use that name. Her name in this story will be what she became to me, which is simply my boy's fiancée. And later, the woman who laughed. My boy was 41. This was his first serious relationship in years, and I could hear something in his voice when he told me, a looseness, a relief. He was happy. That mattered to me more than anything else. The engagement party was held at the fiancé's parents' home in Upper Arlington, which is one of those Columbus neighborhoods where the houses have names instead of just addresses, and the driveways are longer than most people's backyards. Her father was a cardiologist. Her mother, I was told, did a lot of work with the Junior League and various charitable foundations, which is a particular kind of sentence that tells you exactly what kind of person you're dealing with before you shake hands. I drove down the Friday before the party to spend the weekend. I stayed at a Marriott rather than impose on my boy, who was living temporarily at the fiancé's apartment while his lease was up. I brought a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion. Navy blue, good fabric, simple cut. I brought a hostess gift for the mother, a nice candle from a shop in Akron that I like, and I brought the quilt. I need to tell you about the quilt. When my boy was born, my mother Louise came to the hospital and she brought a quilt she had made by hand. It was not fancy. It was pieced together from scraps, from an old house dress of hers, from a flannel shirt that had been my grandfather's, from curtain fabric left over from when she'd redone the living room in 1974. She had embroidered his name in the corner in her looping, unpracticed hand. The stitches weren't even. She was not a skilled quilter. She was a woman who worked at a plastics factory 40 hours a week and made this in the evenings at the kitchen table because she wanted her first grandchild to have something made with her own hands. My boy slept under that quilt until he was 7. Then it lived folded in a cedar chest in my bedroom closet for 34 years. I decided to give it to him at the engagement party. A quilt made by his grandmother before she died to go with him into this new life he was starting. I thought it was the right time. I thought it was the right thing. I pressed it carefully. I wrapped it in tissue paper inside a box I'd bought from a packaging store with a card that explained what it was and where it came from. I wrote in the card about my mother, about the factory, about the kitchen table, about the uneven stitches that I'd always loved precisely because of their imperfection. The engagement party was on a Saturday evening. About 60 people catered in the back garden of a house that could have held twice that number comfortably. My boy met me at the door, and he looked so handsome and so happy that I squeezed his arm and didn't say anything for a moment. His fiancée was pleasant to me. Careful, but pleasant. Her parents were cordial in the way that people are cordial when they're doing you a favor by being cordial, if you understand what I mean. The mother. I will call her the mother because that is what she was, wore a cream-colored linen dress and had the posture of someone who had never once doubted that a room belonged to her. I was seated at a table near the back of the garden, not the family table. I noticed, but I didn't say anything. I ate the food and talked to the people near me, and I was fine. I have been underestimated in rooms full of people who had no idea who I was for 40 years. One more evening wouldn't break me. After dinner, my boy made a small speech. He talked about his fiancée, how they'd met, what he loved about her. It was genuine and a little awkward and very him. I sat there with my hands in my lap and thought about the little boy who used to make me speeches from the back steps about why he deserved a later bedtime. I was so proud of who he'd become. Then he said, I also want to say something about my mom who drove down from Akron today. He looked at me from across the garden and I straightened up. She raised me on her own and she worked harder than anyone I've ever known. I wouldn't be standing here without her. The room clapped politely. His fiancée smiled. I smiled back. Then the gifts portion of the evening happened. Apparently the family did gifts at engagement parties, which was not something I was familiar with, but I followed along. Envelopes were presented, a set of monogrammed towels, a weekend reservation somewhere in wine country. Each gift was held up and exclaimed over appropriately. When my boy opened my box, he pulled back the tissue paper and went quiet for a moment. He looked up at me. I nodded a little. He reached into the box and lifted the quilt out carefully, and I saw his expression, that particular softness that only happens when something reaches all the way back to your childhood. This was Great-Grandma Louise's, he said to his fiancée, half in explanation. She made it by hand. Mum kept it all these. Is that a quilt? The mother had leaned over. Her voice was amused. Not curious. Amused. Yes, my boy said. It was. How charming. She tilted her head in my direction with a smile that did not reach anywhere close to her eyes. Did you make that yourself, dear? My mother made it, my boy's grandmother. She looked at the quilt the way you look at something a child has drawn on the wall. Then she turned to the woman beside her, her sister, I think, and said in a voice she clearly didn't see any reason to lower, "A homemade quilt. I suppose that's sweet. Something you'd expect from the help." The garden was not entirely quiet. There was still the sound of glasses and conversations at other tables, but the people near us heard. I could tell by the way two of them looked down at their plates. My boy heard. I know he heard because his jaw tightened. I watched his face, and I watched him say nothing. He said nothing. He smoothed the quilt across his lap and said, "Thank you, Mom, it's beautiful," in a voice that was careful and controlled, and then he moved on to the next gift in the pile. I stayed for another 40 minutes. I finished my dessert. I said goodbye to the people I had spoken to. I hugged my boy at the door, and I told him I loved him, and I drove to the Marriott and sat on the edge of the bed in my navy dress for a long time. I thought about my mother at the kitchen table, the factory noise she still heard in her sleep sometimes, she told me once, her hands under the lamp, the needle going in and out, her first grandchild's name in letters that weren't quite straight. Then I thought about what I was going to do. I was at Walter's office by 9 the next morning. He's a careful man, Walter. He listens before he speaks, which is rarer than it sounds. I told him the whole story, the party, the quilt, the mother's voice, my boy's silence. I told it plainly without editorializing. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What would you like to do, Irene?" I had thought about it all the way down the highway that morning. I'd thought about it in the Marriott elevator and in the parking garage, and in the 14 minutes I sat in my car before I made myself go in. I told him. He leaned back in his chair. He took his glasses off and set them on the desk. He said, "Are you certain?" "I've been certain since about 10:15 last night," I said. "I've just been giving myself time to make sure it was the right kind of certain and not the tired kind." He put his glasses back on. "All right," he said, "let's go through everything. What I had decided was this. Among my 14 properties was one that my boy had always known about because it was in our neighborhood growing up. A 4-unit apartment building on Granger Avenue, 2 blocks from the house I'd rented when he was small. He'd walked past it 1,000 times. A few years ago, when I mentioned I owned it, he'd laughed and said, "You own the Granger building?" "Mum, I had no idea." He thought it was charming. He thought it was 1 or maybe 2 buildings, a small side project. He did not know about the others. He did not know about the commercial property, which by that point had been appraised at just over $2 million. He did not know about the 12 other residential units, or the property management company I'd quietly formed 7 years earlier to manage them, or the investment accounts Walter helped me build from the rental income over 20 years of reinvesting instead of spending. He did not know that the estate documents Walter had prepared named him as the sole beneficiary of everything. I instructed Walter to revise those documents, not to remove my boy entirely. I want to be clear about that because I know how it sounds. I was not trying to punish him out of spite. I was trying to make a decision that reflected what I now understood about how he saw me and, by extension, how he would see what I had built. I left him the Granger Avenue building, the one he knew about, the one that was, to him, the whole of what I owned. It generates about $38,000 a year in rental income. It is a solid property. It will take care of itself. The rest, the 13 other properties, the commercial building, the investment accounts, the property management company, I directed Walter to redistribute. A portion to my sister's children, who had spent years checking in on me and driving me to appointments when I had my knee replaced and calling on Sundays just to talk. A larger portion to a scholarship fund I established through the County Community Foundation, specifically for young women from low-income households who want to start small businesses. I named it after my mother, the Louise M. Hatcher Small Business Scholarship. That part, I want to be honest, gave me more satisfaction than I expected. Not the taking away, the giving too. The idea that somewhere down the road, a 19-year-old with $43 and a baby and more willingness than resources would have one door that swung open instead of staying shut. My mother would have found that enormously funny and also wonderful. She had that combination, could hold both at once. I drove back to Akron on Sunday afternoon. My boy called that evening, which was not unusual. We talk sometimes on Sunday nights. He asked how the drive home was. He said the party had been fun. He did not mention his fiancée's mother. He did not mention the quilt, or what had been said, or what he had not said. I listened to him talk about an upcoming work trip and a restaurant he'd gone to that week, and I said the right things, in the right places, and at the end I told him I loved him, which I meant, and we hung up. 3 months later, on a Tuesday, my boy called at a time he didn't usually call. He said, "Mom, I had lunch with Walter today." I waited. He said he had some documents for me to review as part of your estate planning. I waited. "Mom, I didn't. I had no idea." His voice was careful, like he was stepping around something in the dark. "The properties. How long have you been?" "A long time," I said. "Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because it wasn't information you needed," I said, "and because I wanted to know who I was to you when I was just your mother, who cleaned houses and made do. I know who I am when I have money. I wanted to know who I was without it." There was a long pause. "What did Walter show you?" he said. "He showed you what I've left for you," I said. "The Granger building. It's a good property. I've kept it up well." Another pause. Longer. "And the rest?" "Goes where it's more needed." He was quiet for a moment that stretched in a way I felt in my chest. Then he said, "Because of what happened at the party." "Because of what didn't happen," I said. "At the party." He knew what I meant. I could tell by the silence that followed. Not an empty silence, but a full one. The kind that happens when someone is sitting with something true that they would prefer weren't true. "I should have said something," he said finally. "Yes, I didn't know how." "I know that. That doesn't make it no," I agreed. "It doesn't." We talked for a while after that. Not about the money. We'd said what needed to be said about the money. We talked about other things, careful and honest in a way we hadn't been in a long time. He told me that things with the fiancé had been difficult lately, that he'd been doing a lot of thinking. I didn't ask questions. I let him talk. Before we hung up, he said, "Grandma Louise's quilt. Where is it?" I told him I'd taken it back home with me when I left the party. "Do you still have it?" "It's back in the cedar chest," I said, "where it's been for 34 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Will you keep it safe?" "I always have," I said. "What I want to say to you, and I mean you, whoever is watching this, whatever brought you here, is that the quilt was never really about the quilt. My mother didn't make it so it could sit in a cedar chest forever. She made it because she wanted her grandson to have something of her when she was gone, something that said, I was here, and I made things with my hands, and I loved you before I ever met you. The woman at the party looked at that quilt and saw a poor woman's project. She looked at me and saw the same thing. She was not entirely wrong about what she saw. She was completely wrong about what it meant. I have cleaned other people's bathrooms. I have fixed leaking pipes on a Sunday morning in November because I couldn't afford to call a plumber. I have eaten sandwiches in my car between properties because there wasn't time to stop anywhere. I have worked in ways that people with linen dresses in long driveways will never have to work, and I would not trade a single year of it because every single one of those years built something. I am 67 years old. I own things. I have given things away. I have a scholarship in my mother's name that will outlast me, and I have a quilt in a cedar chest that I will keep safe for as long as I am able, when the time is right. Not now, but someday, when I understand better who my boy is becoming and what he's learning, I'll know what to do with it. My mother taught me patience the way she taught me everything else. Not by explaining it, just by example. Night after night at the kitchen table, the needle going in and out one small stitch at a time, building something that would last. I learned from the best. I've been asked, since all of this became known to the people close to me, whether I regret it, whether I think I was too hard, whether I should have given my boy more time, more grace, more room to be imperfect. I think about that question honestly. I don't dismiss it. Here's what I know. I am 67 years old, and I have lived long enough to understand that what a person does in a moment of discomfort tells you more about their character than anything they say on a good day. It wasn't the silence itself that broke something between my son and me that night in the garden. It was what the silence revealed. That in the space between hearing something wrong and choosing to speak, he chose the easier path. That's a choice, and choices accumulate into who we become. My mother Louise never had the language for what I'd call cause and effect. She didn't talk in philosophies. She talked in practicalities, but she lived the principle her whole life without naming it. What you put in is what comes back. Not from the sky, not from some force-keeping score, but from the simple fact that habits shape character and character shapes outcomes. She worked honestly. She loved without conditions attached to status. She made things with her hands because making things was how she showed up for the people she loved. And because she lived that way, I knew, even as a child, exactly who she was and what I could count on. I tried to raise my boy the same way. I think mostly I succeeded. The man who gave that speech at the party, the one who looked across the garden and said I was the hardest working person he'd ever known, I believe he meant every word. I do. That's the part that made the silence harder to carry, not easier. He knew better. Knowing better and still saying nothing is its own kind of choice. What I did with the estate documents was not punishment. I want to be precise about that. Punishment implies I wanted him to suffer. I didn't. I wanted what I built to go where it reflected the values that built it. My mother made that quilt one careful stitch at a time at a kitchen table after a full day at a plastics factory, not because she had time to spare, but because she understood that the things worth having require something real from you. I built those 14 properties the same way. One careful decision at a time, over decades, without fanfare, without anyone's permission or approval, or even awareness. I am not interested in being impressive. I never was. I am interested in being honest, with myself first, then with the people I love. Honesty has a cost. I have paid it. I am still paying it in the Sunday phone calls that are a little more careful now, in the questions my boy is learning to ask that he didn't think to ask before. What I hope for him, truly hope, not as leverage, not as condition, is that he becomes a man who can stand in a garden and choose the harder, more decent thing, even when it costs him comfort. That is the only inheritance that actually matters. Everything else I gave away to a scholarship fund, and I named it after a woman who understood that long before I did. The quilt is still in the cedar chest, waiting, as it has always been,